Okay, welcome. This is part 3 of your anatomy notes for the nervous system. Together we've already covered kind of an overview of the nervous system, and we've covered nerve cells, their structure, how they talk to each other, some different types of cells that are involved. We've covered the spinal cord and the spinal cord reflexes. Today we're going to cover the brain, the structures, and we're going to cover the brainstem and just the hindbrain and inner brain, though. Okay. We'll do the cerebrum tomorrow, next time. These would be pages 7 and 8 of your notes, okay? And I hope that we can try this new format and see if it works out, okay? So let's follow along on the structures of the brain. The brain itself is made of approximately 1 billion neurons. Remember, neurons are nerve cells, which contain trillions of synapses. That means connections. And it's good to have a lot of brain cells, but really it's the synapses that are where the number of synapses is really kind of determining how functioning you are, and your memory, and how much integration that you can do of all these signals that are being processed. Okay, so let's just look at the structure. This is a mid-sagittal section, so taking the brain right down the middle. Write down what we're going to label in the other picture, the longitudinal fissure, where you can see left and right sides of the brain. They look very identical, okay? So they took that cut down there, and then they cut through some of the structures that are in the middle of the brain. We're going to label those because you can see them very well in this view. Okay, so kind of to orientate ourselves, this is the anterior side. I'm going to make that here. So the other side is the posterior. So this is the back of your head, and this would be where your eyes would be and your face down below. Okay. So just to start, you may have heard of the frontal lobe. Here we'll label it. You can't tell any clear distinction super well between the frontal and the parietal, but there are some ridges here and some sulci that we'll label that kind of, you might be able to tell a little bit of separation. But they do different functions, which we'll cover later. And of course, the back is the occipital lobe, and these might sound familiar because of the bones that cover these lobes. We've gone over those, and they're similarly named. Now you can't see the temporal region because that would be too lateral, okay? So this is the mid-sagittal cut, and then we're looking at one of the halves. Okay, so this structure in the middle, it's called the corpus callosum, and it enables left and right sides to talk to each other. So it's like a superhighway. It's very big. It's colossal. Okay, and the cerebellum is another structure that you might be able to easily identify that's separate than the rest of the cerebrum. Okay. Next, I think we should talk about the ventricles, because we did talk a little bit about the cerebral spinal fluid and the ependymal cells, and the fact that your spine has that kind of hole in the center. It's the central canal, and it goes all the way up the spine, and it becomes the ventricles in your brain. And ventricles are just spaces. They're lined with ependymal cells, but they make the cerebral spinal fluid, they filter it, they take away toxins from the nerve cells, or at least allow toxins to pass through with the help of the astrocytes. And they allow the brain to be bathed in cerebral spinal fluid and nutrients, which is important too, because your brain can't really be resting on anything. It's too delicate. The neurons would get damaged. So the brain's floating in cerebral spinal fluid. So that fluid is generally made in the choroid plexus. We're going to call that space. The choroid plexus that resides in the fourth ventricle. And we're going to color that red because just remind us that there are blood cells, capillaries and such, that are feeding into this area, because we know that your brain doesn't get direct blood supply, which is good because you want that barrier between your blood and your neurons in case you have toxins in your system, so that doesn't affect you super bad, and your system can clean it out, like your liver and kidneys and such like that. So it's good to have that blood-brain barrier and to protect us. All right, so another structure here that you can't see really well on this view, but we can still label it, is the thalamus. And the thalamus, as we'll learn later, is kind of a gateway. It acts sort of as a filter of sensations, and it groups them so it's easier to process all of this sensory information coming from all parts of your body. Okay, so we talked about the spaces in your brain. This is also a space in your brain, and we're going to call it the third ventricle. And there's some on both sides, so we'll say third ventricles. And we'll label this with an orange. How about that? So this is all just the space, okay, with the cerebrospinal fluid and then ependymal cells lining, okay? Another structure that we've kind of mentioned before is the hypothalamus. And you might not be able to see it super well, so I'm going to just color it. Didn't come through super well on my picture. And it's below. Yeah, hypo, below. You can see it better on a different section, but that's approximately where it would be on the other side of the brain. And then this structure down here, if you can see it, might look familiar. It's kind of like two little cherries grouped together, and that's your anterior and posterior pituitary gland. So we'll just call them the pituitary gland, okay? It's more of a gland, and we'll know, at least later for sure, if we don't know already, that pituitary gland gets hormones from the hypothalamus and gets sort of controlled and regulated by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the other structures that we want to label here are the brainstem, which can be divided a little bit differently depending on your point of view. Okay, so these three structures at the base and leading into the base of the brain and leading into the spinal cord are the brainstem. So all of your neurons and sensory information going to the brain and motor neurons or inner neurons leaving are going to do that through this brainstem. So first we have the medulla. We'll talk about in a second. And the pons that bulge above it. Some people combine those and call them the pons medulla, but they could be also considered part of the hindbrain. And then we have the midbrain. You see that? And then the forebrain is above that, much above it, okay? Let's see. Spinal cord. Yeah, just to have it on your picture. And we're going to go over some more of the structures more in depth, but here's another view. This is reminding us that it's the frontal section cut, so down the ears, and it's going to divide some of the structures in the brain just a different way, so you can see some of the left and the right. So here, down here, maybe you can see this is our cross section. These are the optic nerves. And you'll be able to see later when we add the eyeballs back on how that kind of goes from the front to the occipital lobe in the back. Other structures that we should be aware of, well, just in general, if you have time, realizing that the outside, about 1 centimeter portion is the gray matter. So the surface, we call the cerebral cortex kind of like crust, and it's gray matter because that's where a lot of these nerve cells are being connected with, and the cell bodies then will reside oftentimes in the surface here, and then the inside where we don't have specific structures, we just have the axons of neurons that are connecting. Okay, so white matter, like we just label it right here, it's fine. We can squeeze it in there. Right, that's myelinated. I have a spot, well, yeah, right here. Let's label the cerebral cortex, okay? It's supposed to be 2 words. Reminding ourselves that this is the gray matter, and that's the cell bodies. So that's important to protect, because that's where all your connections are going to and coming from when you're thinking and processing in the different lobes of the brain. There's the longitudinal fissure that we were talking about earlier. And we kind of also want to notice that we have these ridges and that we have grooves. And that's to increase the surface area of your brain, because the more connections, the more ability that you have to think and store memories and have higher reasoning. So our brain is pretty foldy. And it does increase the surface area, so it increases the amount of gray matter, and that's good. The more folds, they say, the more higher level thinking that the creature will be able to be. So these bulges we call gyri. And the sulci are the grooves of different sorts. And they usually, follow a pattern, and some of the deeper ones might be ones that separate different lobes of the brain. It should be noted, though, if a person has damage to a brain when they are, before they fully developed, a lot of times different areas of the brain will be recruited, completely different areas of the brain will be recruited to do that function for that person, and then they can go on fairly normally if they can. All right, so another structure that we haven't really talked about yet is, these lateral ventricles, I guess. We're going to label lateral ventricles. I'm labeling them purple, by the way, or sort of coloring them purple, okay? Right there. All right. You couldn't see them because they were kind of on either side. And we talk about the third ventricle and fourth ventricle, but we don't talk about too much more than that in this class. Just note that there's more ventricles where that came from, okay? Here, these lines, by the way, they look kind of inconsequential. That's actually part of your corpus callosum that we sliced into for this view, okay? So it enables the left and right to connect and talk to each other, hopefully. Okay, so let's label that again. I'm sad I didn't give him a color, but his color is no color, I guess. Okay, so that's your corpus callosum. And another structures here, some structures here that you see, they're gray, because they are gray matter, so the cell bodies don't just reside on the cortex of the brain. But we're going to call these the basal ganglia. Oh. I got excited and started coloring the thalamus. Sorry. That's okay. All right, so basal ganglia here, kind of like our dorsal root ganglia. They have gray matter and cell bodies. And they're going to be coordinating unconscious movement and higher thinking process while you're doing some unconscious movement too. So just a sneak preview of what's to come. Okay. So, the thalamus. We were going to make that yellow. Kind of the gateway for processing sensations. So that's good. And it's yellow for thalamus. You couldn't really see it because it was on the lateral sides mostly, so you couldn't see that in the mid-sagittal section. In between, though, was that third ventricle that we were looking at before, where a lot of stuff is kind of nearby. At least a lot of stuff in the limbic system. And there we go. Let's make that orange. You can really see that. Supposed to be the third ventricle. Okay. Down here in actually spots here is the hypothalamus. Okay. And we know the hypothalamus to be kind of a master controller because it heavily controls and influences a lot of functions in the body, including the pituitary. Okay, squeeze that in there. Okay, made him green, just like above. I can't see the pituitary gland in this view, but that's pretty much what we're going to study for the structures of the brain, and then we're going to talk about what they do. All right, so ventricles, back to ventricles. There are 4 cavities or open spaces within the brain, 2 lateral ventricles, and you have a 3rd and 4th ventricle. Okay. The ventricles contain a capillary network that we like to call choroid plexus. And that's where cerebral spinal fluid is made. We talked about how important that cerebral spinal fluid is for protecting the brain and letting it float and feeding it nourishment. Sorry, that's supposed to be CSF for cerebral spinal fluid. Got to edit that. It's so cerebral spinal fluid is made from the blood plasma pulled across the membranes from tiny blood vessels. And remember, that's the tissue of the brain and in the spine. And it flows, and we'll give you another diagram later that shows that flow. The wall of each ventricle is lined with ciliated ependymal cells, as we reminded us before here, that circulate the cerebral spinal fluid made by the choroid plexus. All right, so enough on the structures where they are for now. We're going to go over the brainstem and what it kind of does for you, starting with the medulla oblongata. It contains cardiac centers that regulate your heart rate, okay? And vasomotor centers that regulate the diameter of the blood vessels so that they can regulate your blood pressure. So if you want your blood pressure to decrease, they would relax the muscles that are around the blood vessels. There's some smooth muscle on the blood vessels. And if you wanted to raise your blood pressure, you would have those muscles constrict. The respiratory centers there also that regulate breathing rate, just making sure that you're breathing enough. And these are vital. So it seems like the most vital and basic brain functions are lower down in your central nervous system, and then it kind of goes up from there, starting with the brainstem and going to and ending with your frontal lobe. So we also have reflex centers here for basic functions like coughing, sneezing, vomiting, and swallowing. Now, these are things that if you didn't do, your air pipe would and respiratory centers would get clogged, and so that's important. Next is the pons. That bulge contains respiratory centers that work with medulla to create normal rhythmic breathing. Otherwise, your breathing will be spotty. Some of the other neurons in here connect the medulla with other parts of the brain so that those sensations and regulations can be processed and affected. Then this is also considered the hindbrain. I think we mentioned that before. So I want you to do a little swoopy here. And actually going to combine that with the cerebellum. So considered hindbrain. Not everybody breaks these up like that. So that's why we're just kind of squeezing that in there. Okay, so back on the midbrain, that's next. The midbrain connects the pons to the hypothalamus through the cerebral aqueduct. And I think I did not label the cerebral aqueduct. So why don't we go back there and see if we can put that on there. Yeah. Okay, so we got midbrain. So they're just showing that that third and fourth ventricle are connected to the cerebral aqueduct. Here we go. Now we're good. And that's, of course, the passageway for the cerebral spinal fluid connecting the third and fourth ventricle. And also in the midbrain, of course, we have other things going on. We have visual and auditory reflexes. So not just muscular sensory data, but things like turning your head when you hear a loud noise, tracking a ball in flight, or ducking when something comes flying at you. Okay, so those are a little more complex reflexes. The midbrain is also concerned with writing reflexes. So we did talk about some basic writing reflexes, but this is to make sure that you are actually standing upright in conjunction with the gravity. So they keep your head upright. Also maintain balance and equilibrium, and it works with the inner ear to do that. That's how we know where up is up, generally speaking. Though lots of times we use our eyes to, if we can see, to keep ourselves upright. So you kind of have to kind of close your eyes and maybe, practice that and realize, yeah, your inner ear is also affecting how you view which way is up. If you've ever had problems with your inner ear, then you know how important that is. And when you are having trouble with that, it's bad. Let's see, the cerebellum, let's talk about that next. It's working below the level of conscious thought and regulates some things while we're doing other activities, okay? Like coordination. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Hopefully. Some of us. I might struggle. We can also make sure we get muscle tone and keep our muscle tone. Actually, it keeps things all ready to contract at a moment's notice. And how far to reach and when to end the movement. Also, maintenance of the posture, which I need help with, and equilibrium. Again, staying upright. The cerebellum and midbrain use information about gravity and movement provided by receptors in the inner ear as well. All right. Cerebellum is also involved with certain sensory functions, oddly enough, like judging an object's weight. So a lot of times when an infant's developing these connections, that's what they're doing with their toys. And they're moving things and, coordination and trying and sensing things, and just in general, it's super important for them to be grabbing things and playing with things, even if they're sticking them into their mouths, because that's how they learn, and that's how the brain connections get made, and they pick things up and stuff like that, or try to. So next, we're going to talk about the forebrain, and that is super interesting because we have some complex emotions that get processed here. Or can be. Complicates things. Okay, so the forebrain includes the inner brain, and the inner brain is where the hypothalamus and thalamus are located. Okay, but a lot of times we like to lump it with the forebrain. That's different than the midbrain that we just kind of talked about. All right, confused? Yes. Okay, good. So the inner brain in the forebrain and also the cerebrum is part of the forebrain. The olfactory bulb, that's the nose, and all other structures of the limbic system. And I kind of threw this on here for limbic system because we don't usually go through it much, but just to make sure you know, limbic system is a complex system that includes the edge of the cortex that controls instinct and mood. Basic emotions like fear, pleasure, anger, it drives hunger, sex, dominance, and care of offspring. So just going to list some structures involved. The hypothalamus is one, the thalamus, inner brain, which we talked about, and the amygdala. We'll talk about a little bit later. Maybe you want to just, for funsies, realize that the amygdala is kind of the fear center where that gets processed. The hippocampus, never can remember what that does. I'm kidding. It's the memory. Processes what should be remembered and what maybe doesn't need to be. So Yeah, maybe you can remember that. I remember that like hippos remind me of elephants, and elephants are really good at remembering things, even though hippo in Greek is more like for horse. That's okay. That's fun. And the basal ganglia, we talked a bit about that, how it helps in like coordinating movements more later. And cingulate gyrus. Okay. We don't go really into that in this class, but just to kind of give you an idea, the cingulate gyrus, it processes emotional behavior. So let's write that down maybe, but it does a lot of other stuff too. It's in reward-based learning and functioning and autonomic motor function. So it's just neat to kind of mention. All right, so that's the limbic system. But now we're going to go back to the interbrain, okay, which is the posterior division of the forebrain, okay? The bottom of the front. No, I'm just kidding. So first, we talked about the hypothalamus a little bit, especially when we talked about the endocrine system, but it does even more than that, all right? It is a mass of brain tissue that is the control center for many activities, like reproductive activities, pleasure, pain, hunger, thirst, blood pressure, temperature, we have talked a little bit about that, growth, metabolism, and other visceral functions. All right, and how it does some of that is by producing releasing hormones. That will tell the anterior or pituitary or posterior pituitary gland to secrete its hormones, and those hormones could be like growth hormones. So the hypothalamus might secrete growth hormone releasing hormone, okay, or gonadotropins that are related to reproductive development, corticotropins like for stress and management there, thyrotropin, metabolism and thyroid. So those are releasing hormones that are going to cause the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones. In general, the hypothalamus regulates body rhythms. Also, secretion of hormones, sure. Involved with sleep cycles and changes in mood. I didn't leave a lot of space there. Or your mental alertness. So at what times of the day are you going to need to secrete a little bit of adrenaline so that you're going to be awake? And what times of day that you need to kind of calm the nervous system down, hopefully, so you'll be able to sleep. So your daily clock. And remember, if you mess with that for perhaps at least an hour of when the time you normally go to bed or normally wake up, you kind of get this little lag problem, and it takes a little bit for your brain to adjust. So that's why a good regular schedule is really good for you. Well, the hypothalamus also releases dopamine, which is like the reward hormone and involved with motivation, focus, memory, movement. Yeah, that stuff is dope. Kidding. But it is involved with a lot of stuff, and we want to put motivation there. Maybe we all could use more of that. I've also learned that dopamine gets secreted before you do an activity if you're used to thinking of that activity as fun or rewarding. So it helps you get motivated to do it again, even if that activity might be harmful, like eating a lot of cake. That's something to think about. Okay, your hypothalamus also releases somatostatins, which are going to oppositely block growth and decrease metabolism. So it is very much involved with regulating homeostasis. These hormones are then stored in the posterior pituitary gland until they're needed. Okay. Or I think, yeah. Regulates also body temperature. We talked about that. We talked about homeostasis through nerves, right? In the feedback systems. It also regulates food intake by detecting chemicals in the blood, like leptins and others. Okay, just put that down there. You can look into that more if you like. The hypothalamus also integrates or interprets autonomic nervous system, the involuntary nerves that regulate your heart, blood vessels, intestines, as well as visceral responses like blushing and increased heart rate if you're angry. So a lot of physiological emotional responses. It produces the hormone oxytocin, which creates uterine contractions during labor, and it's also the bonding hormone. You know, we may have talked about that too. And antidiuretic hormone. Which, like it says, tells your kidneys to save water, and it maintains blood pressure that way. Now, these hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary. I know we said that the posterior pituitary releases the hormones, but they don't make their hormones. And the anterior pituitary as well doesn't make its hormones largely that it releases. So it's important that your hypothalamus makes enough, and then it might tell the anterior pituitary or the posterior pituitary when to release them. All right? So it's really the hypothalamus is the control center for that. Quickly, the thalamus, we talked a little bit about it being the gateway. It's where sensory impulses are first enter, okay? Except for smell. We have olfactory for that. The impulses are grouped before sending them to the cerebrum, where then they are, quote unquote, felt, if you really want to say. So if the sensations got blocked at that point, you wouldn't feel them. It's just sort of processing them. And it's also telling you to ignore unimportant ones and reduce the amount of information that the cerebrum needs to process, because otherwise your sensory neurons are sending up signals in your spine all the time about what's going on in your skin and in your muscles, and you need to not have to think about so much. It'd be way too much. It'd be exhausting for your brain, and I hope that, your hypothalamus and thalamus are working well so that you can regulate all that and take a break. All right, so thanks for coming along with us in this new kind of system here, and I hope that you got that. But if you have questions, please feel free to ask me, and I'm excited about this next step, because then next time we meet, we'll be able to go over the cerebrum and a lot of those functions too as well. Super interesting. So take care and talk to you later.